So I'm very happy to be speaking to Raya today. Raya is the founder and CEO of School of Humanity, an innovative online high school that's offering a fresh perspective on education by veering away from traditional learning paradigms. Thank you for joining us, Raya.
Thank you for having me.
So in a nutshell, what is School of Humanity and how is it different from other high schools?
So School of Humanity is an American online high school with a really innovative learning model. Our mission is to reimagine education in order to better serve the next generation. And how we do this is in a number of different ways. But essentially at our school, our learners learn by tackling real world challenges. We do this because we know that challenge-based learning can often be so much more relevant and inspiring and engaging for learners because it allows them to see the direct relevance of what they're learning in the context of a real world issue. We're a global high school. While we're licensed out of the US, we have served learners from over 53 countries and counting across both our high school and summer school programs. We also decided not to adopt any of the existing exam-based curricula and actually create our own literacy-focused curriculum that is informed by the knowledge, mindset, skills that are most needed for today's world.
Wow, okay. Do you have like a main focus area or like a country you started off from, or were you born as like a global high school and your very first cohort was already made up from kids from all over the place?
Yeah, very much the latter. Our very first cohort had 10 countries represented in the high school, and in the summer school it was 20 plus, and then it just kept growing in a global way, and that is across all like the 5 continents as well. And so one of our biggest challenges as a team for the longest time has been that question is, you get told that the world, you can't just promote something to the world, you have to have geographic focus areas. And now we are seeing a bit more of a focus and interest in emerging economies in Middle East and North Africa. But really, we're very global as a high school, which is part of the learning experience for our learners as well.
Something that jumps up to me immediately is, and this might be interesting for fellow startuppers who are listeners, and I don't know how much you want to give away on this side, but how did you manage to come up with a global first cohort to launch with? What's the story behind kind of the roots, the beginnings of School of Humanity?
Yeah, I think, well, it actually starts with the team. So when I founded School of Humanity and I was looking for a founding team, the world was my oyster, truly. I decided to go with the global remote approach, which is obviously pretty mainstream nowadays. And so our founding team already was across several continents. And then, that culture of growing globally as a team has continued as a remote first and online organizations. Our educators come from all around the world, our mentors come from all around the world. And so when we went out to launch our first summer cohort, it just made sense not to create boundaries around geographies. We stayed open. Some of the key logistical things we had to keep in mind was things like time zones for a cohort-based model of education. We from our first cohort thought about like what would be the time zone considerations. Other considerations include language, geographic pricing, thinking about different economies. We follow a sliding scale tuition model with different aid buckets, so that allows us to be much more global with our pricing as well. And so those are just some kind of logistical considerations if you're thinking of launching a global offering.
Yeah. And you mentioned a very important topic when launching a globalized service or globalized, well, school in this case, geographic pricing, like up to how, based on however much you are happy to disclose in this sense, but how did you figure that part out? Like how much is there price discrimination based on geographic location, and like how did you navigate that?
Yeah, it's a really big question because, monetization in the private education space is so complex. In some countries, families, parents really don't have the habit of paying for private education, whereas in others like UAE, 90% of kids go into private education. So you have very different habits and behaviors amongst families, as well as financial abilities. You also obviously have such a big range of private education offerings, everything from really affordable private schools to truly premium elitist schools. And so for us, it actually came from the place of our mission. One of the reasons we launched School of Humanity is because we saw that there were these progressive models of education becoming accessible in some parts of the world, especially in the United States, some parts of Europe, where things like mastery-based learning, project-based learning were becoming really, really mainstream. Whereas elsewhere in the world, these kinds of models were not accessible, yet families were expressing a lot of dissatisfaction with the traditional industrial era model. So we knew right off the bat we wanted to be on the accessible side. We wanted to be affordable. We wanted it to be accessible to families globally. So what we really did is modeled into every cohort a model that would allow us to always have a percentage of learners that are on full aid, a percentage of learners that are on partial aid, and then a percentage of learners that are full fee paid. And even into our growth trajectories and projections, that is the ratio and model that we always embed into it. And so it allows us also to bring together different socioeconomic backgrounds and have different price points available for parents, which again really contributes to the learning experience for learners, because you end up with a cohort that has such a diverse set of backgrounds and learners represented, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah. So you don't do geographic price discrimination, but it's more based on personal circumstances.
Exactly, but it does account for geography in the sense that it's a more simplified way to be able to account for different income levels, different economies, different geographies, but it's just more simplified to use one factor, which is average household income per year, to determine which tuition bracket they fall into.
Yeah. Do you have like philanthropists backing the financial aid, or did you manage to fit that in a business model in which that was not necessary?
No, we fit that into the business model at this point in time. We have played around with that idea. We've had, for instance, we had one partner last year who sponsored a certain number of our learners to go through a summer school, but we don't depend on it.
Okay, back to kind of the bigger picture of how School of Humanity works. How is it different from other online high schools, since it's a space that kind of grew up exponentially during COVID, I guess? It's I guess the question before asking this, or kind of entailed by this question of mine, is whether you feel it's a crowded space or not, and the two kind of go hand in hand. So do you feel it's a crowded space to some extent at this point? And how does School of Humanity differ from other online high schools?
Yeah, and it's a great question. Before I answer that, we have to remember how big the education space is, right? I mean, if you look at even the number of English-speaking potential students in the world and use that as your first layer of the market, there's plenty of room for everyone. So that's like the first mindset that we usually go into this with. Now, most online high schools, they just use the same model and curriculum that has existed in traditional schools, right? So they oftentimes go with the, let's say, traditional exam-based model, or the qualifications like A levels, IB, AP, and so forth. And so that's one of the big ways that we're different, is we're not just online, we're online and progressive. So we've adopted some of the pedagogies that have become proven over the last decade, but mostly in brick and mortar schools that we've moved online. So that's one of our key differentiators, is we bring in project-based learning, interdisciplinary learning, challenge-based learning, allowing learners personalization into an online space. And I don't believe it's a crowded space globally at all, especially in this progressive space. Now, there are countries where it might feel crowded. For instance, as I mentioned before, the United States has lots of progressive schools, lots of micro schools, lots of project-based schools. So for families there, maybe they'll have lots of other options, although we have been seeing a lot of interest from the US. However, we see in many, many parts of the world, being a global high school, that there's a huge need. And chances are we alone won't be able to serve that need. There's a need for even more progressive education.
Yeah, I phrased it in kind of a way to encourage you to tackle the competition side, but for sure I don't personally feel like it's a crowded space, precisely because of the reason you mentioned. There's it's such a big area, high schools globally, I mean, and so even though there have been a few coming up, especially during COVID, it's still such a big space overall. I'm curious to understand more about the curriculum at your school, and how you've structured it, both on a side of like the personalized learning path, the material that is studied. Like, have you developed some material yourself? Have you sourced material from traditional publishers or from the internet? How have you structured all of this? And yeah, if you can kind of unpack this a little bit.
Absolutely. So as with any mastery-based school, we start with standards that we set for our learners. So in our case, these standards are mapped out in our core curriculum, which we call the human literacies. Now, illiteracy is defined by the OECD as a combination of knowledge, skills, and dispositions. And so our human literacy framework has a collection of knowledge, skills, and dispositions that we want all learners to meet. And it's organized into 8 broad categories that include flourishing, discovery, which is more the sciences, thought, creativity, action, society, quantitative, and technology. So there's a balance of the hard and soft skills in the core curriculum. Now, just as many American kind of curricula, we have, we have different credit areas that our learners can attain at a foundational and advanced level. But some of the ways that, let's say, this is different from a traditional school curriculum is we've put into our core curriculum credit areas that normally are considered, let's say, supplementary. So there's actually a credit on emotional intelligence. There's a credit on mindfulness. There's a credit on participation, on logical reasoning, critical thinking, just as there are credits in geometry and biological sciences and so forth. So we've brought in some things that traditionally have been, claimed to be important, but not tested in traditional exams, and brought them into the core curriculum and said, these are just as important as those other kind of knowledge areas that we focus on in schools. Now, we've set these standards. Learners have to attain 30 foundational credits in 9 and 10, and 5 advanced level credits in 11 and 12. How they get there is extremely personalized and up to them. So, for example, one of our credit areas is on data analysis. One learner might actually do, we have a unit on data for sustainable development goals, so they might do that unit and attain that credit. Another learner may have actually applied it in a passion project where they did a survey and analyzed the data and did their own research. Someone else might have come in already having that skill and evidenced it through a certificate. So there's a lot of personalization on how you get to that roadmap. It's not all of us going through the standardized, let's say, course. It's this kind of a roadmap that's developed for each learner. The other thing is every term we run challenges. So for instance, last term we ran 2 challenges, one on maintaining global peace and one on designing space habitats. And so a lot of the credit areas are mapped to these challenges. So in designing space habitats, they learned chemistry by looking at the atmosphere of Mars, and rocket propulsion by looking at, physics by looking at rocket propulsion, creating economies on Mars and what that would entail. So, and then they work on their own solutions and projects in the second half of the term relating to the challenge. So it's just a bit of a glimpse into how the curriculum is structured and how we help learners towards those outcomes.
What comes to mind here, perhaps I didn't quite catch it completely. How do you make sure you're not compromising on the skills, like the essential skills that are thought to be kind of more set by a curriculum? Let's take, for example, I don't know, statistics or or calculus even. I mean, do you is that personalized as well, or is there a core curriculum on that side?
Yeah, so with mastery-based schools, and maybe I'll take a moment to describe what a mastery-based model of education is in case listeners aren't aware. How mastery-based education works is you do set very rigorous standards. So these are like the outcomes you want your learners to work towards. Let's say one of those outcomes is statistical analysis. Underneath that, you flesh out very detailed learning targets. So you say for a learner to be good at statistical analysis, they have to know how to collect data, clean data, conduct averages, ranges, standard deviations on data, and then you can go really into detail. And you do assess learners at those standards. So even though they can get there in a personalized way, one learner might accelerate through those standards in a week, another learner might take months, but you do take them into that common outcome ultimately, right? Where it can be personalized is in the later 2 years, we allow learners to pick which credits they would like to pursue depending on their own personalized kind of outcomes after school, after they graduate. But every learner who's, let's say, doing the statistical analysis credit will get to that outcome that is benchmarked then against other outcomes. It's the way they get there that's really different and personalized, and the way it's assessed is much more project-based. So we don't rely on a traditional time-bound, paper-based exam to determine whether they have that skill. Rather, we either design projects that they do or they create their own projects that evidences that skill. So for example, again, using the statistical analysis example, we have a project-based unit called Data for Sustainable Development Goals, where learners first learn about collecting data via hypotheses. We actually have the UN SDG data sets that they learn how they apply statistical analysis on. Then they visualize the data and learn about charts and graphs. And they create this project of analyzing this data set throughout the journey that evidences that they have this skill rather than taking a paper-based exam.
And okay, I understand the assessment side of this, but for the skills themselves, let's say, are they encouraged to go out on the internet and find them, and then you assess, and then perhaps, I don't know, your tutors direct them in the right direction, or do you have a core courseware for some aspects of some hard skills, or perhaps you direct them to Khan Academy? I don't know. Is there anything like that?
Yes, for sure. So if you look at a learner's weekly schedule, there's a balance of synchronous and asynchronous learning. So they spend about 12 hours a week in workshops with the facilitators, and there's different kinds of sessions that we do. So for instance, one of our sessions every week is on flourishing and emotional intelligence. We have a quant lab, which focuses on quantitative skills. The challenges I described before are workshops as well. So there are sessions, cohort-based learning sessions where facilitators guide them through these learning journeys. And they're very, very interactive. We do lots of games and activities, and we do design a lot of these sessions ourselves. Now, the other half of it is self-paced learning, right? Honestly, it's a mix of things. Like, we went into it knowing there's a wealth of information out there. We did not want to necessarily become a content repository. We felt like it's more about curating personalized journeys. And so we often design the projects ourselves. We design the assessments ourselves, but curate content for learners. And of course, now you even have generative AI to help create content, matching it to the level of learner. And we've started playing around with that as well. So it's a combination of things. We've designed a lot of our own units, a lot of our own sessions, and we've also curated a lot of content that we believe is high quality to help learners get to those learning outcomes.
I think part of the answer is also in the synchronous part being considerably important in your program. Who participates in the synchronous sessions? Is it a whole cohort made up of how many students, or are they like divided into subject areas based on what they've chosen to study?
Great question. So they are all together. So the way we are visioning grouping them is the foundation levels, which are grades 9 and 10, or year 1 and 2 is more accurate way of describing it, are together. And then year 3 and 4 will branch off into the advanced levels when we get to that point. And it's a bit of a mix. So we have, for example, mentorship sessions every week where we bring in an industry leader who is tackling the challenge to mentor learners. These are smaller sessions, usually 8 learners or less. The workshops can sometimes be 15 learners. One of the sessions is a bit bigger. So there's a mix of sizes throughout. At the moment, they are mostly together, except when they split up into their mentorship. The self-paced learning side, where they select units, different learners select different things and build up their own personalized curriculum along the way.
Right. Just to give some context, how many cohorts have you launched up to date? How many students do you have currently enrolled, or past students, if you've already graduated a cohort at all?
Yeah, no graduates from the high school yet, but we launched our high school last September with 20 learners from 10 countries. We're now going into having 42 learners from 15 countries joining us in about 2 weeks. And we also do our summer school, which is an abridged version of the high school, as well as programs with existing schools and partners. And across all those programs, we've had over 500 learners and alumni over the last few years from 53 different countries participate in our programs.
And have they graduated from their respective high schools, any of them?
Yes, yes. Some of those older learners have gone on to university. Some of them have launched their own initiatives. Some of them have come back to intern with us. So it's been lots of great stories there.
Have you been able to extract some data on, let's call it, I mean, you're at your early stages, which is fine. It's a little early to be talking about longitudinal studies, but some data of about the students who have joined summer schools, and like how their experience with School of Humanity might have impacted them.
Absolutely. And we're working on even more longitudinal evidence. Before I share some of the internal stuff, we actually have one of our parents who's going on to do a PhD at University of Bristol, who's going to be doing research on the school from a community perspective. And of course, there's all the data we're gathering now for accreditation. So one of our favorite questions to ask learners is whether they love learning at School of Humanities. So they're often given like options. Do you love it? Do you like it? Is it okay? Do you hate it? And about 90% of them like or love it. So that's like our favorite metric, that they're enjoying their experience. Since joining School of Humanities, every learner basically works on projects and solutions. We've had over 500 different projects and solutions come out of the programs as well. And I think, we're doing more alumni research, but we've had learners who have gone to traditional universities on full scholarships. We've had learners that have gone into progressive universities like Minerva, which, our program was a great catalyst for. And so, yeah, lots of great anecdotal stories right now coming in from those learners. And I think what we've also seen is that even within our high school, you can start to see success stories even within the first 2 years. One of our learners is taking one of her projects on food waste and is actually launching a startup on it. She's in 10th grade, by the way. One of the other learners in the UK, Arthur, he's on the advisory board for UNICEF. So we're seeing amazing stories come up even at this point in time.
That's pretty impressive. I'm quite surprised about the context of a high school kid being able to launch a startup so early. I'm sure perhaps even being within an environment of an early school itself, of which the founders are startuppers themselves, is kind of encouraging this. Do you think you're going to be able to retain this at scale, this kind of motivation that the early environment kind of gives students?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've seen examples of organizations that have gone really big but maintained that entrepreneurial spirit, right? It's what the whole exponential organization framework is based on, is those 11 characteristics that really large organizations can maintain to ensure that they stay agile and adaptive. And so when we designed our school as an operating system, we did look at those frameworks like EXOs and actually implemented them into the model of the school. One of our visions for scale as well is, even when we get big, to stay small. So that even, let's say, if you have 10,000 learners, they're organized into these small cohorts of, let's say, no more than 100 learner per cohort, with a certain number of educators, which if you compare to the traditional school of having a few thousand students in the school versus, those cohorts of 100 or less, even when you have that scale. That's our hope, because human connection is such an integral part of our model and of doing something like this. And I think that's the power that actually technology can provide, is tools like AI, tools like digital platforms can help us digitize all of the admin and make it so much more efficient, so that the educators and the community can focus on that social and community learning that is ultimately one of the most meaningful ways for us to learn as human beings.
I was wondering, so I think the human aspect of the educators holding the synchronous sessions, but as well acting as tutors for students, are strongly responsible and also empowered to kind of maintain that small scale feeling, even if you grow as a school, even while you grow as a school, that you were mentioning. So I was wondering about educators at School of Humanity. How do you recruit them, and what kind of person are you mostly looking for?
So we always like to have a balance of, let's say, traditional educators that have all that training and expertise in pedagogy and lots of classroom experience, as well as people who come from an industry background that have natural kind of inclination to be a good educator that we, let's say, put through some training. That balance is awesome because you get that teaching expertise and then also get really practical insights from the workforce and really be able to give feedback to learners that is relevant. So our educator body often consists of that mix. To be honest, in the beginning, we and others around us, our advisors, were predicting that might be one of the hardest aspects of what we're doing, because it's such a novel approach to teaching and learning that there wouldn't be enough educators out there who are trained to in these pedagogies. But that has just proven to be false. Like we are always overflowed with resumes when we're recruiting of incredible educators. And I think the sense I'm getting more and more is that most educators are really frustrated with the traditional system and the constraints that it puts them in, and are really excited to practice more innovative approaches, more personalized approaches, more human level approaches. So it's been really interesting seeing that interest from educators around the world.
And I suppose the opportunity to work from remote is also quite enticing.
For sure. The work-life balance. I mean, if you look at most data, I think especially coming out of the US, educators are not only underpaid, but really burnt out as well. And so I think the remote aspect and the possible work-life balance that can bring for educators is really, really powerful. The other thing to note is, we've actually redefined the role of the educator. So traditionally, teachers do everything. They design, instructional design, they facilitate, they grade and evaluate, they do admin, parent communication, technology, so they do everything. But we actually split it to some extent into different roles. So we have learning designers or instructional designers. We have learning facilitators that facilitate the live sessions. Sometimes there's an overlap between the two. We have learning administrators that support the educators with the admin and the tech and side of things. So, and that's also really helped because you can really allow educators to focus on their area of strength within teaching. And, if you're facilitating, you don't have to worry about designing because the instructional design materials are provided to you. So that also really helps from a flexibility and work-life balance perspective.
Yeah, and you can also work on the economies of the institution, the school, as in the case of the learning design aspect, you can kind of you can put economies at scale to work on the development side of the learning curriculum, for example, whereas you don't want to use economies of scale on the human part of teaching and education, but there might be little bits and parts of the educational process that you can extract and take away, like the workload from the tutor, from the educator, and you can do the scale aspect, the scaling on that, and also bring down the price point in so doing. And I've seen with market forces coming into education in some ways, and this depends on the various jurisdictions around the world, this has been possible, and it's one of the ways to like bring down price point for excellent education. I'm wondering, like, how have you thought about this aspect?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, it's a big question for us, especially as we did our seed round about a year ago, and now going into mapping out what does the path to 10,000 learners look like, and how does it get there while maintaining this kind of a model, right? Because if you start from first principles, most of us agree that a fully asynchronous model isn't what learners need in today's world. There is a human element that is needed for a really high quality education, but that becomes very difficult to scale. I am really excited about, I know AI is a buzzword now, but I am really excited about the potential there, specifically with some of those aspects that you mentioned, that there's a desperate need to scale. So for example, with project-based assessments, they are typically so much more time-consuming to grade than traditional assessments. Very difficult to scale, but we also know that they're more engaging for learners, they're more relevant in today's world, and that they simulate a more real-life task rather than memorizing and retaining knowledge. And traditionally, that has been a huge barrier for project-based schools, is all the times and iterations that it takes you to give feedback to a learner on a project and to get back. But I do think the kind of generative AI and like ChatGPT capabilities that we're seeing can be used to automate the first layer of evaluating a project against a rubric. And then that really cuts down the educator's time. And it's not that you fully automate that. You should have a human level of kind of intervention. But something like that could cut out, 10, 15 hours of an educator's time per week, which is a huge, margin, let's say, to bring down the cost even further for families.
Yeah, sure. Have you already experimented with
Yes, we are. We have started to play around with it. We are building out our own platform right now, our own learning kind of system, not just to be a content repository, but to power the model that we have by learning through challenges, by allowing personalized learning journeys. And so it's a necessity, I think, for schools like ours to start having those kinds of capabilities available to them. There are also other existing tools out there. Our chief learning architect, Kevin, was telling me about something called RM Compare, which is also an automated adaptive project-based assessment tool. But what RM Compare does is, instead of grading against a rubric, it can take like 20, let's say, artifacts of learning, 20 projects, and create a rubric from it. So it'll create a ruler of like, these are the best ones, and here's why, and these are the okay ones, these are not so good. And then you can automate any other assignment from then onwards in terms of grading to place it onto a rubric. Wow. And so it's really some really fascinating stuff is coming out in terms of how we think about assessments using tools like this.
Right. I've spoken to fellow startup founders in your space or similar spaces that have been bringing in, for example, Canmigo or services, and this is quite normal in again, market forces acting on education. You can also source external providers to outsource a little bit of what you're doing and kind of bring it together in your own recipe while building some parts yourself and also just buying a product somewhere else. Have you been doing any of that?
Spot on. So for example, we have a whole domain of our curriculum focused on technology. And we did build out some of the technology curriculum ourselves, like around tech ethics and so forth. But we use Codecademy for the languages because they're amazing. They're project-based. There is no reason for us to reinvent the wheel when there's so many other coding platforms out there. So there's definitely instances of that. Even when building out our own platform, there are aspects of it that are leveraging existing platforms. And I think if you're not doing that, it's often a waste of time and resources because someone's probably figured out how to do X, Y, and Z efficiently. You just need to bring it in the right way. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think. And if you really, really can't find the right solution for something, I think that's the only time you should be building it yourself.
This is interesting. Are you somehow able to did you connect with Khan Academy? Is there an API or is there a framework by which you can extract data on student performance and bring it back onto your own platform and kind of monitor students' progress in a way that is effective for teachers?
It's a great question. So you mentioned Khan Academy specifically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we haven't done anything like that with Khan Academy. I mean, there's
in this case, I was mentioning Code Academy.
Oh, Code Academy. Sorry.
Code Academy just
yes.
earlier.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So Code Academy actually doesn't have the capabilities to do that directly. We can see learner progress actually, but we cannot export it out. So an educator will need their own kind of, let's say, school view of the platform, which the Code Academy does provide. But that is one of the biggest challenges in general to do what you described. Like we've started feeling this pain a term into the school. We had all these different tools and platforms. Almost none of them had open APIs to actually move data out. And some of them would have open APIs, but for some data, not others, and others would really only have it at a ridiculous cost. So I do think there is a desperate need, not just to move content from one system to another if you're purchasing a content repository, but to also be able to move learner info and be able to build dashboards of live learner progress. It has been a challenge when you're mixing and matching tools from different places.
Sure. So I'm wondering on the business side, you mentioned you had your seed round. Now, how long have you been operating for?
So we are about 3 years old now. We had the first year of bootstrapping and then a few months of fundraising. And then we're going into year 2 of post-raise. And we did our seed investment round with EIM Global, who are a pioneering group of schools in Singapore, investing really mostly in sustainable education. If you've heard of the famous Green School in Bali, they own the Green School in Bali. So they led our seed round last year.
How many people do you have in your team?
We are now at 11 core team members.
Does that include educators?
Yes, it does. Sorry, actually, no, it doesn't. Sorry, 11 core team members and an extended team of educators and mentors that support as well. So including the educators, we're up to 20.
And this is fully remote-based team?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Wow, okay. So we spoke earlier about how this might be very enticing for educators. How is it working out for the core team?
I think we love it. Obviously, the grass is always greener, and that sometimes you're like, oh, I wish we could go and hang out more and see each other in an office space more. But we like many remote teams, we do an annual retreat where we all meet each other for the first time. In fact, our learners also have their annual gathering every year where they all meet each other for the first time. Yeah. So it is really important to us. So luckily, we've had the opportunity to meet already. In addition to that, we are now increasingly starting to pilot and experiment with hybrid learning as well. So last year, we launched a learning hub in Dubai, just as you have co-working to allow for co-learning. So learners are still enrolled in our online high school, but they can get together to learn together and educate around, access facilities, maybe do some in-person workshops as well. And then this year, some of our families in Bristol, UK are also bringing together. We have a couple of in Bristol for a hub in Bristol. So we're starting to kind of go into this hybrid space, and it's early days, but we're really excited because we do think the future is hybrid.
Is this part of the vision? And I guess it's early to tell, but kind of have these learning hubs spread around the place, perhaps partnering with providers of learning of co-working spaces that can then be redesigned for students. I don't know. Have you looked into any of this and how to scale this? Is this kind of a vision, or is it too early to even mention this?
No, it is. It is very much a vision. Again, if you start with first principles, the ideal model of learning for a high schooler isn't online only, right? You all have to have some in-person component for a meaningful human connection, for socialization, access to facilities, and so forth. So it has been in the vision of the team, and we have started to really explore what that could look like. Not just co-working spaces. You have a lot of existing learning centers, which are even more appropriate given being child-friendly and then being safeguarded for minors to be around. Although the hub that we have here in Dubai is built out of an innovation hub, a co-working space. So we're trialing that as well. And there's different variations and shapes and forms that a hub can take, right? You can embed a hub in an existing space. You can take a hub as far as building out a space for it. And there's everything in between. And I think time will tell which approach is possibly most effective.
What were you referring to with learning spaces that you just mentioned right now? I'm not quite sure I know what you're talking about.
All right. So, when we started conversations around potential hubs around the world, we quickly realized there are lots of existing assets like learning centers, whether it's tutoring centers, other innovation hubs designed for youth. UAE, for example, has a number of youth hubs that are specifically spaces for youth to do extracurricular programs. So they're not schools, although schools could potentially be a space for hubs as well. They're learning centers usually for enrichment programs and so forth.
Okay. So these might be both public or private.
Yes. That's true.
Right. I'm wondering, again, as far as you're willing to disclose, how does your marketing strategy work?
Yeah, no, it's actually a really important part of the mission because we're doing something that not a lot of families are familiar with, right? Yeah. So if you're already in the homeschooling space, maybe somewhere in the US where there are lots of progressive schools, you might know what some of these terms like challenge-based or inquiry-based mean and how they're different from the traditional system. So it's really like our marketing approach itself needs to be educational to help families from around the world understand, okay, how is a traditional project or how is a project-based assessment different than a traditional paper-based assessment? And these are kinds of things that we often have to do a lot of outreach to raise awareness on. So we've been doing a lot of thought leadership, a lot of showcasing, model the curriculum through our learners, the stories, the testimonials, and it's a constant learning journey. We're constantly trialing things, testing things, understanding what works, while also, of course, remaining authentic to the mission and vision. The other thing is most people probably notice we're very intentional about our branding. In terms of how we brand ourselves as a school, and finding the balance between the global inspirational aspect and also, of course, making sure there's the familiarity of feeling like a school. And so there's a lot of thought that's gone into how we brand ourselves to communicate our mission.
Right. What's up for School of Humanity? Do you have like any new projects coming up? Any upcoming expansion that you would also perhaps like to announce right now?
Yeah, I think we're one of the things that we're increasingly doing more of is partnerships with existing schools, private and public. And this was not actually originally in the plan, but the moment we launched, we started having schools reaching out to us, asking us, can you do a summer school for our students, or can you run, we want some of our learners to potentially do your high school. Our traditional system is not serving them. So that's one space we're really going intentionally into over the next year, is taking what we are building anyways and seeing if existing schools or governments would like to partner up and collaborate with us. And we have a couple of exciting stuff coming up in the space. We have a cohort launching with Al Fateh Education Foundation here in the UAE, which is actually going into its 3rd edition of the program. And yeah, that's just the gist of it. But really, I think what we're most excited about is we're currently just preparing for the new academic year and doubling the size of the cohort. We have lots of new families to onboard over the next few weeks. So my team and I are quite busy with that for the time being.
Are the partnerships with existing schools that you were mentioning, are they are they for the summer camps that you organize, or is there some level of partnership with schools even for your whole year tuition program?
Yeah, so we're open to both. Naturally, most of the times, the summer school is a great place to start. It's a great way to even see if the families and learners are interested in a model like this. But we are in conversations with schools who are interested in exploring what offering School of Humanity as an alternative pathway full-time could look like in their school. We also last year started kind of going into a bit of professional development, because we've built all of these internal PD sessions for our educators on some of the topics we've talked about today, like interdisciplinary education, mastery-based learning, and we have been collaborating with schools who wish to also upskill their educators on some of these key concepts. And in a few instances, like we had one really large-scale government partnership in the region where it was taken to the next level in terms of consulting in a more bespoke project with them. So we've been quite open, but they generally fall into these 4 brackets, which is the summer school, alternative pathway with the full-time high school, professional development, and then last but not least, bespoke and consulting stuff.
Right. You kind of already answered part of my follow-up question regarding the public sphere. Like, has there been contact with public schools? Because often, and again, this depends country by country, but they're kind of, much more bureaucratic, and it's much harder for principals to reach out to a private provider and experiment on how much to outsource. What's your experience with that? Perhaps with different jurisdictions, has this even happened, or is the only aspect that you've begun collaborating with in the public sphere with the government project that you were mentioning, that is therefore much more top down rather than one individual principal or school itself reaching out to you?
Yeah, definitely that is the case. It is so much, it's a longer process to collaborate with a government entity in general, especially in the education space. There's the bureaucracy, but there's also much more like layers of due diligence and procurement to get through. And oftentimes, of course, it's not just a question of you deciding to go out. There's the government bodies in the region often do RFPs, and then they have a project that they put out for bidders, and multiple organizations will bid for projects. So it's a much more complex and longer process collaborating with governments in the region. So we have seen some traction. Of course, it's easier to just work with private schools and so forth. However, I do think that our mission calls for ensuring that we're collaborating with the public systems as well. In fact, I personally have a hypothesis that the way models like this become extremely affordable, if not completely at no cost to families, is through government partnerships. And there's some really interesting models of this private-public partnership emerging in the region. So you're now seeing governments in the region who are contracting private schools to run their public schools, because they've realized that traditionally governments have just been not so great at running public systems of education, it's really inefficient. But if you look at the average cost per learner, it's as if they would have been enrolled in a private school. So why not give that money to the hands of parents who can then enroll and allocate that funding into any of these, let's say, accredited list of schools from the government? So that's a model that we're seeing in the region, which I think is a really interesting model. It kind of goes parallel to the space industry in the US and the SpaceX NASA thing, right? With NASA contracting SpaceX as a private entity to now do a lot of its transfer to the ISS. So I think there's potential. Yeah.
I think you're mentioning the school voucher system, which has been, I mean, there's a few jurisdictions that have implemented it a bit more than others. Is it exactly the school voucher system you're describing, or are there some major differences with? I don't know if you've heard much about how this has been implemented in some of the states in the US.
Yes, I've been following that. It's similar, but in the region, what they've done is literally it's still a public school, but a private school has been contracted to operate and run it. So government of Abu Dhabi is doing this. I think this model is being called a chartered school model here in the region. So it's free for anyone in the sense that they're enrolling their kids into a public school, but the operation, the quality, and this team and the staffing, all of that is actually done by a private school provider.
Right. And this would be in the Dubai region in the UAE?
Yeah, government of Abu Dhabi has been doing this, which is the capital of UAE. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm very curious to follow up on that. And also I'm very, of course, curious to see how you manage to find spaces and probably open up spaces within these developments, and just with your with all of the School of Humanity, both on the summer camp sides and also on the new cohorts you're launching in your full time tuition online high school. It's been very interesting to talk to you today. Thanks a lot for being with me today, Raya, and I look forward to seeing how your enterprise develops in time.
Okay, so thank you so much for a lovely conversation, and I appreciate all of the support. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.